All right, Ty Mansfield, welcome to the Cwic Show. Let me give just a little bit of a background on yourself. You are a practicing marriage and family therapist and an adjunct instructor in religious education at Brigham Young University. Our topic today is on mindfulness. You have completed your undergraduate work in Asian studies, which I'm guessing may have had something to do with going into this topic, into this field and understanding a little bit more. You've actively been practicing mindfulness for over 10 years, and you're a certified mindfulness meditation teacher. You and your wife, Danielle, and your 5 children live in Spanish Fork, Utah. Okay. So that is our topic for this episode, is mindfulness and what this is. The thing that I like about this, when I read the book, is the idea of awareness, right? It seems to me like anybody who has an idea of both self and your world around you, right? The more aware we are of ourselves and the world around us, the more we're able to progress. And that seems to me like takes a little discipline, takes a little work. You have it defined here in your book, mindfulness, as paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. So I get the whole being in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And trying, as we've heard the phrase, living on purpose. But what does it mean to be paying attention non-judgmentally? And why is that important?
That's a really good question. I think very often we're socialized or conditioned to relate to the world with a lot of judgment. We use, even speaking specifically to emotions, right? We say things like, I feel good or I feel bad, right? And there's no feeling called good or feeling called bad. What we typically mean by that is that there's emotions that I like or feelings that I like or feelings that I don't. But those terms don't speak to the value of the experience, right? So, I could smoke a joint and feel really good, right? Or in a way that I might like the feeling, but that doesn't mean it's healthy for me. And a lot of the feelings that we call bad are productive, they're adaptive. So sadness, fear, anger, all of those emotions have an adaptive function, and we can respond to them in healthy or unhealthy ways, but the emotions themselves have a purpose that ultimately want wholeness for us. And so a mindfulness-based approach to working with emotions would be to get out of judgment, to learn how to sit with even very difficult emotions, right? There's no rule that you have to like them, but to respect and honor that emotions, even ones we don't like, have a purpose and a function. And when we can sit with them, be curious about them, learn from them, then we can respond to them in a way that that is going to be productive and, again, adaptive. So there's lots of things that we do, or we have kind of stories and judgments and expectations about the world and what should be and what shouldn't be, and all of those narratives are in some ways rooted in some kind of judgment. So to get out of judgment is to learn how to just be with an experience in a more open, compassionate way.
Okay, so give us an idea of why mindfulness is so important. I mean, you've mentioned a couple things, but why should this be an objective for someone?
Well, I came into mindfulness through mental health. So you had mentioned Asian studies in undergrad, and there was some experiences that I had in my undergrad that I think later I kind of circled back to, but it wasn't until I started my master's program in marriage and family therapy that I really sort of intersected with mindfulness. And about 40, maybe 40 plus years ago, through some work by a physician named John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness really started to make headway into Western medicine, Western mental health, simply because of the mental health benefits. And so, learning, for example, specifically with depression and anxiety, but it can help with stress management and, eating. There's mindfulness-based approaches to eating, working with eating disorders and addiction and just about everything. But, some of the things that foster depression and anxiety is what we call rehearsing and rehashing, right? We're in the future or we're in the past. We're not really in the present moment. And so learning how to just be in the moment and less stuck in the past, less anxious about the future, it can help a lot with mental health generally. But mindfulness as a Western, in sort of our de-spiritualized Western applications, was really rooted in a lot of Eastern spiritual practices, at least in the way we experience it in the West. There's a strong contemplative tradition in Christianity, but the secularization of mindfulness really kind of came through Buddhism. But all of the principles, I think, have a very strong spiritual component too. So me and the other authors of the book, all of us, at least two of us really kind of came through more of a mental health entry point. The other two, maybe three, through mental health. The other is he does his professional work is in Asian studies, so I think it was more kind of just exposure to Eastern culture and thought. But as believing Latter-day Saints, even though we came into it from a mental health lens, my worldview, my history, my experience, my faith is all Latter-day Saint. And practicing mindfulness as a mental health intervention really just really started to feel transformative spiritually as well. When I was, I would go to these meditations and I would find myself wandering into prayer, and those prayers were some of the richest, most connected, most communing that I've experienced. Because it's easy to get into kind of a transactional way of doing prayer, right? We kind of offer our, we say what we speak the things we're grateful for, we ask for what we want, and then it's not really a way of being with God. It's, again, a bit more transactional. So I think mindfulness opens us up to a more a communing experience with God, being with God, rather than just being in our head doing theology. But also there's a lot of mental health benefits as well. So
would you say you brought up Eastern thought in this? Would you say that Western thought is more based then in our past and our future, and Eastern thought lives in the moment more?
I think Western thought, especially with our Enlightenment rationalist heritage, we're really in our heads a lot. We think about things and we study things, and there's certainly value to that. But I think we're very cognitive and we're very task-based and doing-oriented, right? And in Eastern thought, they will differentiate between a doing mode of mind and a being mode of mind, right? And we're doers. And I think there's a little bit of paradox too in the gospel, in that the restoration started in the sacred grove, but the beehive is one of the great kind of symbols of how we do life. We're very industrious, right? And we're very practical, and there's a lot of value in that, right? And I think it's kind of, but I think there can be a kind of distortion if we're only doing all of the time, because Jesus, he did things, he healed and he taught, but he also took time to retreat, to just be with God in solitude and in the wilderness, and both of those were important.
So you mentioned here in the book, by the way, I don't think I mentioned the Power of Stillness. So that's kind of a focus, I think, of what being of mindfulness is, right? It's a stillness, mindful living for Latter-day Saints. So the book is really focused on how you're going to take stillness, mindfulness, and apply that to the gospel, right? To living and a practical living for Latter-day Saints. Right. You quote here a couple Catholic leaders, Thomas Keating, who I'm well aware of, and Thomas Merton, once described meditation, not as a newfangled innovation, let alone the grafting onto Christianity of an Eastern practice, but rather as something that had originally been at the very center of Christian practice and had become lost. Yeah. Interesting point. I mean, it's interesting because Christianity really is an Eastern religion. I mean, that's actually where it's founded in. Did we, as we moved west and we had Western thought, is that kind of what maybe started pulling that away, that idea of meditation away from a core practice of Christians?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Terrell Given's work is really interesting in this area. He's sort of kind of traced, the evolution of different strands of Christian thought, and you have as the church grew, and you have the centers of the church at Rome and Constantinople, and then how those trajectories split, and then the Western tradition, and then Protestantism growing out of that, and Mormonism really was birthed in a very Western evangelical Protestant America, right? And a lot of our religious heritage has been kind of a Calvinistic King James language, right? And he's done some really interesting work, particularly with his recent book, All Things New, Rethinking Sin and Salvation and Everything in Between. He and his wife Fiona both, and I think there's something there, and part of his thesis is that we're still kind of outgrowing our Protestant heritage, and I think with President Nelson's theme of the ongoing restoration, right? I think my experience of our early Latter-day Saint leaders, starting with Joseph Smith, but Brigham Young and John Taylor, there was as much of a feeling of the restoration being a receptacle of truth as it was a dispenser of truth, right? That even as we're gathering Israel from, all the four corners of the world, there was a feeling of we're also gathering truths from all, from all four corners of the world, that the things that God has revealed to all nation, kindreds, tongues, and peoples all belong to us, right? Joseph Smith, he said that, if there's any truth, whether it belonged to a Baptist or a Presbyterian, it's Mormon, right? That all truth is Mormon. And Brigham Young, commission the elders of Israel to go out into the world and gather every truth that you can find, bring it home to Zion, right? So there's this sense of, in this unfolding restoration, it's a gathering as much as it's a dispensing, and implicit in, Book of Mormon teachings, right? That God has been revealing and working with, all nations, and all of those truths needs to be gathered into Zion in order for the restoration to reach a fullness.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's also, he focuses a lot, kind of that marker of an Augustinian moment.
Yes.
Prior to that, you find a lot of different, actually LDS doctrines and practices. And then there was a lot of shifting. In fact, it's interesting, actually, Augustine's mother actually believed that there was a father and a son and that they were separate beings. But then he moved down a different path, obviously. But okay, so you have you follow this up with Thomas Keating and Thomas Merton here, with the idea of you quote a Latter-day Saint here who teaches mindfulness, John Kessler.
Yes.
And this is what you quote with him. It says, "I believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has the potential to engender the most profound meditative tradition in the world." Based on what you just said, we're still kind of in that Protestant mode in many ways. How does that happen, and why would we be in a position to have such a profound meditative tradition?
I think as we integrate, because Buddhism is very it's very process, right? It's very getting still, quieting, being. But in terms of there being a revelation per se, or a kind of a personal relationship with a deity that is guiding us, and I think that the restoration and our conception of God as a very personal deity, who wants to guide us, who wants to be with us, who is parenting us actively all the time, where the Spirit, where we're nurturing and growing in light and truth, but both kind of growing in light, but also this dialogic, again, kind of Terrell Givens, coining this term, this dialogic experience with God. That's something that you just don't have in Eastern tradition. And bringing together the best of both, right? This personal relationship with a deity who loves us deeply and is concerned and is kind of leading us on this developmental path into godliness, with the processes that can help us do that by being more deeply with that God, right? I think that combination of these two pieces really engenders something that's bigger than the sum of the parts.
So for someone that is a modern Western person like myself, and I start looking at this, how is this going to be different to me than this first thought that comes to my mind is this is some kind of a hippie type of a thing, because I'm not used to this, right? This is a very different type of thought. Meditation. I mean, my wife's tried to get me to go to yoga. It's like, why, how do you tell somebody, how do you relay the importance? Because I see the importance. I do see the importance, right? I understand how I need to settle down more sometimes, how I need to be still. How do you relay that importance to someone? Because as a church, let's be honest. I mean, we when you talk about productivity, we're unbelievably productive, and we're proud of that.
Yeah.
We get things done, and yet there's a lot of stress in the church also.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I think we included in the book, one of the co-authors, Jacob, talks about this a lot, where he said that, as people experience kind of faith crises or faith transitions, he said very often they're not rejecting the gospel, they're rejecting an impoverished experience with it, right? And I think very much if we're just in the doing and we're it was interesting actually, to back up for a second, about, I guess it was 2005, BYU, it was on the bicentennial anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth. And BYU and the Library of Congress co-sponsored this symposium, kind of looking at the contribution of Joseph Smith to the religious world. And Douglas Davies, who is he's a Christian scholar who's been very interested in Mormonism and is friends with a lot of Latter-day Saint thinkers and leaders. He made a comment there that stayed with me, and he said that it seems to me that Latter-day Saints tend to relate less. This is a bit of a rough paraphrase, but he said that it seems to me that Latter-day Saints tend to relate to Christ less as a kind of have less of a personal relationship and less of Christ in the heart, right? That's a very kind of Protestant idea. But more tend to relate to Christ as the leader of the church to which they belong, right? Rather than having an intimate relationship. And in many ways, we have an institutionally mediated relationship with God, right? We're active in the church, and we go to the temple, and we do the things, we follow our church leaders, right? And there's certainly a place for all of those things, but if they become more of a substitution for our experience with God rather than a facilitator, and to use the language of Elder Ballard, a scaffolding, right? Then we lose something. We're not living in the power of who God is. We're just doing lots of things, and we get burned out, right? And so I think what mindfulness and just this way of being with ourselves, with God, with each other, it opens us up to a real kind of intimacy and richness, and that is really at the heart of a living, vibrant faith, as opposed to just actively doing religion, right? I mean, we burn out on that, and there is a lot of spiritual burnout that people struggle with, right? And you've got a lot of active Latter-day Saints who struggle with depression and anxiety, and and maybe not more so than the broad culture, but we certainly there are many who aren't living in the fullness of, I think, what our faith invites us into. And one metaphor that's come to my mind from the beginning since I started practicing this was in the Book of Mormon, right, where the brother of Jared is, trying to figure out what's going on with these barges. He's trying to figure out, how to get light and air and these sorts of things. And one of the, when it comes to light, God says, figure this out and come to me. And so he finds these rocks and he moltens them until they were clear as glass, and then brought them to the Lord and said, will you touch them with your finger? What I think mindfulness and other forms of meditation, mindfulness is just one form of meditation, they're not synonymous, is this sort of clearing out. It's getting clearer about our thoughts, clearer about what's going on in our inner emotional world, and kind of removing the static and the interference. And then in that clarity, we come to God, and then we seek the light and the spirit that only he can give us, right? That we can't do purely on our own. And I think, again, that's kind of where these intersections of Eastern processes and some of these spiritual practices really intersect with our more personal relationship with deity.
That's a really interesting point, Ty. I think you bring up there. I've had these discussions before in regards to. I haven't quite used the same terms there, but in terms of an institutional relationship, where a lot of times it seems in LDS culture we raise up the church, almost almost above God in some ways, in the sense that, as you were saying, the relationship is almost more with the church than it is directly with God. And the doing of going to church, studying the scriptures, even the home things of family, home evening, other things like that, all kind of get this tie to the church instead of an understanding of how the church is there to support our relationship with God. And I don't know. It just from what you're saying here, it seems to me like looking at mindfulness would be a great way to lift up your relationship with God over an institutional relationship, because it's obviously direct. And in fact, I was just reading in this week's Come Follow Me in sections 30 to 36. I think it's in 30. They're talking about how it's talking a little bit, following up on Hiram Page and the fake seer stone, and it talks about, the Lord says, look, there's two things you need to focus on here. And first, he says, is the Spirit, as far as authority for revelation. First is the Spirit, and then second is those that have been put over you, right? So he gives those two distinctions there, but talks about the Spirit being first. And I would think that mindfulness, stopping in stillness, would have a lot more to do with being able to receive the Spirit, and creating a stronger relationship with deity.
Yeah. If I can actually share a couple of statements with you.
Sure.
There's a statement by President McKay, right, where
my favorite
encapsulates this, right? And then there's a follow-up by President Lee. It's interesting, when a lot of the statements by church leaders on meditation, several of them reference President McKay and some private teachings that he did with the Quorum of the 12, and how they'll often say things like, I remember when President McKay would emphasize the importance of meditation. But President McKay said this. He said, we pay too little attention to the value of meditation, a principle of devotion. In our worship, there are two elements. One is spiritual communion, arising from our own meditation. The other, instruction from others, particularly those who have authority to guide and instruct us. Of the two, the more profitable introspectively is the meditation. Meditation is the language
right there. Yeah.
Yep. Meditation is the language of the soul. Meditation is one of the most sacred doors through which we pass into the presence of the Lord.
Interesting.
And then one more here. President Lee said this. He said, President David O. McKay told us, we don't take sufficient time for meditation, quote unquote, right? He said, I get up early in the morning, 5 o'clock, when my mind and spirit are clear and rested. Then I meditate. You can come closer to the Lord than you can imagine when you learn to meditate. Let your spirits be taught by the Spirit, right? And that's, kind of speaking to what you were just saying. All of these things are means, right? The end that the church is set up for, that spiritual practices like meditation are set up for, they're not ends in and of themselves. They're all means to nurture or to help us nurture our relationship with God.
Yeah. How does this fall in line with the idea from Alma, for example, of praying always, praying in your closets, praying here, praying there, and then always having a prayer in our heart?
Mm-hmm.
How does that play together?
It's a good question. I think the way that I would think about that is being present. I think if we're present in the way that God is calling us to be present, we're always with God, regardless of what we're doing. And this is one of the things that I noticed when I first started doing, because when I was in Texas, there was actually a Buddhist sangha that was near where I went to graduate school.
A Buddhist, is that a temple or?
Sangha is just a community. It's a group. And there was a temple in Dallas, and there would be monks that would come and kind of lead these meditations from the Dallas temple in this particular tradition. And I would go just, because, especially early on, like it was really helpful to have kind of a guided practice and be with other people who were doing it. But a lot of it was just silent. And in those moments of silence, I would just find myself wandering into prayer, because it was the most kind of natural place for me to go when I'm silent. And I think if we're doing, again, life right, if we're doing faith right, we're always just with God. When we're with each other, we're with God. When we're doing our work, we're with God. And God is with us, and we just have a sense of that kind of dual presence, And I suspect that at least to some degree, that's what Alma was saying. Like, whatever you're doing, be with God and be present with what you're doing, but let God be present with you in the same moment.
So what about people that are afraid to do this? You brought up here in the book something interesting. It says, because I could see how in my own life and maybe people I'm close to, I've seen this, but you say some find more silence and stillness terrifying, even painful. Mm-hmm. And then, as counterintuitive as it might sound, turning toward whatever is here, even if it's scary or bothersome or uncomfortable, is the beginning of deeper calm and stability. And it's what we would propose as the first most basic step toward finding more internal quiet and calm. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Very often in our Western way of doing life, we're active and busy as a way of sort of sometimes as escaping reality, right? We're in Chinese, the word for busy means death or loss of heart or heart killer. And the word for mindfulness, it means to bring the heart into the present. And a year or two ago, I guess it was pre-COVID, so about 2 years ago, Jacob and I were facilitating. Jacob Hess, yeah, one of the other co-authors. We were facilitating, there's a 12-week, an 8-week program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction that was developed by John Kabat-Zinn, who I mentioned earlier. And one of the men who was participating, I mean, this was a gentleman who had, works for the church. Had been a mission president. And as we talked about being in the moment and kind of being with your thoughts, and he made a comment, he said, I don't want to be with my thoughts. He's like, I've spent most of my life running from my thoughts, right? And he had a lot of trauma as a child, and just kind of engaged the work of the church as a way of kind of escaping that. And, I think his faith was very sincere, and he's a very spiritually mature person. And at the same time, it was terrifying to him to slow down enough for some of his past and his history and all of that to kind of catch up with him. And I think there's a vulnerability in being real. I think sometimes
what do you mean by that? What do you mean being real?
Maybe let me use an example. I think one of the things, we don't talk about it in the book, but I'm working on another book with a colleague on the integration of sexuality and spirituality. We're talking about kind of the way couples do relationship, and there's sort of a bit of a paradox and a tension between between role-oriented relationships, or what we're calling role-oriented relationships, with intimacy-oriented relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And they both have a place, so it's not like a competition. It's there is a when spouses kind of define certain roles within the relationship and they negotiate those, and it keeps the house moving, and he's working and helping provide, and she's taking care of kids, or how are those roles get negotiated? There's a structure, and there's it's helpful to have sort of defined roles. But in a marital therapy context, I work with a lot of people who have kind of mastered their roles, and they don't know how to be with each other. There's
that like there's they each have a persona toward each other, kind of, and it's not, you're saying, is that the persona that's different from the real person?
It can be that, but there's also sort of a way of doing life where it's just comfortable when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you can kind of relax into that. But it's just doing, right? There's one couple, they both have kind of significant callings in their stake, and they both, they're just marrying off their last child. And, they've really, they're both kind of remarkable humans in terms of what they do and what they've accomplished. But the last time they actually really looked each other in the eye and, just sat with each other, like, every time we have he's mentioned that every time they have a marital, therapy session, right, his anxiety goes up. He's like, I'm just comfortable in kind of living out our roles. Like, I don't really want, it's just scary to kind of be with each other, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think even in the church, I think we're more comfortable with roles than we are actually being with each other, right? And we have callings, and as long as you're doing your callings, we're kind of satisfied. But to actually be with each other and sit with each other in more vulnerable ways, in our discussions with each other, or sort of like class discussions, right? We we have the right answers, but people aren't typically very revealing about what's going on in their lives, and yet we hunger for a real kind of intimacy of seeing and being seen, and knowing and being known. And there was a few weeks ago, I was invited to present a workshop it was a stake-sponsored workshop on kind of helping people who had been struggling with addiction, or various things. There was a lot of kind of when there's been infidelity and things, and the stake president was just very kind of forward thinking, and in creating this, and in this day-long stake-sponsored workshop, it was better attended than their previous stake conference, right? There was something about, and it was really beautiful, where there were couples that were sharing their experiences, and they were there to support each other, and it just felt like we're kind of hungering for something that feels more real, rather than just interacting in very role-governed ways where we don't actually have to be with each other, and we don't have to be very vulnerable, but things, the relationships work, and church callings, we're all kind of functioning with each other. So anyway, I think we hunger for a kind of intimacy. We want to, one Christian writer, he said it this way. He said, "To be loved but not known is sweet but superficial, but to be known and not loved is our greatest fear." And that's
interesting. So in other words, the fear is to be known.
Yeah.
Right. Because you want to be loved.
Yeah.
Because you want to be loved. And so the fear is, obviously that's in a marriage, especially, that's like the lab right there of that, is how much is my spouse going to as it says in the movie Meet Joe Black,
Mhm.
why are you still together? Why do you love each other? And the answer he gives is because she knows the worst thing about me and she still loves me.
Yeah. Yeah. And marriage is a crucible, right? This is where we practice this. But I work with so many individuals and so many couples where they're not willing to let their spouse really know them because they're afraid of rejection, or they don't, they're kind of afraid of the judgment that's going to come right there. And so we hunger for it, right? Because I think we're wired to hunger for that kind of intimacy. It's our spiritual birthright. And yet we're scared to death of it. We're scared to death of not receiving it. So we'll kind of play it safe in a lot of our relationships, whether that be a marriage or in our church callings. I think even in the early history of the church, Joseph Smith, this idea of being, calling each other brother and sister,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was Brother Brigham and Brother Joseph. And this idea was meant to facilitate a kind of intimacy. And yet we often talk, Brother Smith and Brother Young and Sister Johnson. I mean, we use it to kind of maintain a kind of hierarchy and formality more than fostering a real kind of intimacy.
I mean, I'll let people know me a little bit here. I don't like it anymore. I don't like it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's so formal to me.
Yeah.
I don't know. There aren't many churches because, everybody used to do that. It's not just the Latter-day Saints that did that.
Yeah.
Everybody in the 19th century used to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think being pulled out of society and moving to Utah and excluded kind of created a culture there where we just kind of held that on. And maybe it's the right thing. I don't understand it, but it is very formal.
Yeah.
So,
well, the idea is that we want intimacy, right? We want
Sure.
that sense of connection, and we often will default to things that kind of keep us in hierarchy and roles and structure because it's safe.
Yeah, that makes sense. So talking about knowing here, you've got a couple chapters here that I was very interested, maybe the most interested of all the book here.
Mm-hmm.
And it is about this knowing,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of them is knowing, seeing things as they are.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you mean by that again? I think you're talking about how does knowing, as you put it here, what does that have to do with seeing things as they really are or as they are?
Yeah. We touched on a number of things there. I think probably one of the things that is kind of central to me is it comes back to this kind of judgment and story. Like, we live in a world of stories, right? We don't see the world as it really is. We see the world as we really are, right? And we have these narratives and stories through which we, understand and interpret the world, and that feels safe to us, right? Even if it's painful, we want a narrative to give something a frame, right? So, for example, like a child who doesn't understand why his or her parents are getting divorced, even though it's painful to think it's my fault, right? They're getting divorced because of me. I did something wrong. It's easier, or it's less painful than not knowing, right? Not having any reason for why their parents are getting divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And so, our brains are wired for narrative, and sometimes God doesn't, God has told us very clearly that my thoughts are not your thoughts and my ways are not your ways. And so to trust a God who kind of operates outside of our ways, the ways of, the things that we personally understand and can comprehend, and it's hard and it's vulnerable when things don't make sense. Or as I was listening to just earlier today to Elder Renlund's talk again from this last general conference about things being unfair, right? Mm. And I think it's hard to live in a world where things are unfair or where we don't understand. And yet one of the kind of the principles of mindfulness is recognizing, it's sort of beginning with what we call beginner's mind, or a not knowing stance, right? Where we have thoughts and we tell ourselves stories, but we also have to kind of understand that these are that there's a difference between what is real and what is true, right? And our thoughts and our stories give us a way of comprehending the world and of kind of comprehending other people, but to surrender those and to really sort of be, in order to really know things, we have to open ourselves up to not knowing, and really being comfortable with not knowing, and
moving into the chaos a little bit.
Yeah.
So, because I mean, the Savior taught in stories, right? So, I mean, it's certainly a way of communicating, and maybe it's a first step of communicating something, right? And okay, this gives me the idea. I'm comfortable with a story. I understand it. It can apply to several different layers and breadth, etc. But maybe that's more up to me then to apply that and see the realities of where that story leads.
Yeah. And letting God be God, that God is, the longer I live, the less I believe in platitudes. Very often we have these kind of formulas through which God operates. And if you do this and this and this, God's going to do this. And I think it helps us to understand God in some ways, but the longer I live, the more I don't think God is violating those formulas all the time. Right. And he just operates in a much bigger frame. And so to just learn how to surrender and just trust God when we don't understand him is vulnerable. And that's part of knowing, as much as not knowing is as important as knowing.
So here's what you say in the book: recognizing thoughts as thoughts rather than an indicator of reality or self, which is along the lines of what you were saying, can provide assurance, because you're saying how scary this can be, but it says it can provide assurance and clarity in the often challenging journey of seeking to discern truth. So to me, that's based on what you've said here and on this statement. Truth can be a little scary, right? I mean, it's if you really want the truth, you've got to step into it a little bit.
Yeah. And we have to be willing to surrender the things that are familiar to us and feel safe to us, but may not be true.
The status quo a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Does this apply to feelings as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, central to this is that, the thing that is truly us is our awareness, right? A central tenet of these practices is that I am not my thoughts and I am not my emotions. I have feelings and I observe my feelings, but my feelings are not me and my thoughts are not me. Kind of a metaphor is that we're the sky, right? And our thoughts and our emotions are kind of the weather, and they're always shifting and changing, and we can observe them, right? But they are not us.
So that goes right to agency, of course. Then along with the awareness is agency. So if someone says, I'm a miserable person, or you're a miserable person, based on what you're saying, that's really not true. You're a person with miserable thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. All right.
There's an identity that's inherent in that too.
Okay.
Right. And in a culture that we live in, that's all about identity, both positive and negative. Right. It's sort of disidentifying, right? I'm not just an angry person. I felt a lot of anger in my life, and I want to understand, why have I felt so much anger? Where does that come from? And what is the root of that? The anger is not me, but there may have been a lot of anger that I've experienced. So I need to, once I get underneath that and understand that, a lot of that grows out of a lot of pain, or a lot, there's a number of things, but we have to disidentify with the experience in order to just understand the experience and get curious about it as something other than me.
So would that relate to being created in the image of God in some sense? In other words, the awareness and the agency is the core part of that image of God then, right? Because we talk a lot about the plan of happiness, right? Or the joy of the white fruit of the tree of life there. But that's, again, if you're separating those things, that's not us. That's what we can have, right? But it's not us really. It seems to me like in the image of God then is if you're separating those things out, it is that awareness and it is that agency that separates from our thoughts and from our feelings.
Yeah. And to take it even further, we could say, I'm not my body. We often identify with our bodies, right? But from a theological standpoint, right, my spirit has come to this time and space and inhabits this body for this period of time for a very specific purpose that is divinely ordained. But we can get pretty attached to these bodies, right? And that attachment can create suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And that's whether it's feeling shame about my body, or just not being able to separate the fact that this is not who I am. This body isn't who I am. It's just this tabernacle that I'm inhabiting as a divine tutorial during this kind of fallen learning experience. There can be a lot of freedom in understanding that my body is not me. It's just it's a tabernacle that I'm inhabiting.
It seems to me like also, if you're saying that and again, if I separate my body from my awareness, my agency, my spirit, my thoughts as well are separated, my feelings as well as separated, it gives me a better approach to saying, which is really the purpose of our mortality, I think, is to control or master all three of those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? If I am my thoughts, how am I supposed to master what's already me?
Yeah. It can feel kind of helpless. Yeah.
Yeah. If I'm supposed to master my body, if I'm supposed to, and be like God,
mm-hmm.
follow his example, then it's pretty hard to do that if I feel like all three of those things are already me. Right?
We have power to affect our relationship with those things. Mm-hmm. I can change my relationship to my body. I might not be able to change my body, but I can change my relationship to my body. I can change my relationship to my emotions. I can change my relationship to my thoughts, and have a much more powerful relationship, and one that is one in which I can exercise, to come back to your comment about agency, right? I can exercise my agency in that relationship differently when I understand that it's something I'm in relationship with rather than being it.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Sense. How does this apply to scripture study? How would mindfulness be an important element of someone studying the scriptures?
I would say something. It's, as with anything, you could say the same thing about the temple. You could say the sacrament or any kind of ritual that we do. It's being with the Word of God. We're not just reading words, because again, we're very often in our heads, and we're thinking about things cognitively rather than just being with these ideas or words. And so, as you're, feasting upon the Word rather than just reading the scriptures, we're kind of sitting with ideas. We're sitting with phrases. We're sitting with words. We're meditating on those things and kind of opening ourselves up to, what might God teach me about himself, allowing this to be, again, a means to an end rather than an end in of itself. But in a more present way, because for a lot of my life, reading scriptures was just something you got through, right? So I could put in my time and check it off, right? Whether that was 15 minutes or a chapter a day or whatever it was, checking the box has never led to any spiritual growth. So thinking of being with God through the scriptures and again, a present, contemplative, open, compassionate way, right, is I think there's more space for God to reveal himself there.
Yeah. Okay. So taking that a step further here, you've got as far as the gospel and an understanding of its principles in the church itself as well. You've got a quote here from Lao Tzu,
mm-hmm.
which is, "Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving till the right action arises by itself?" How would mindfulness help someone going through a faith crisis?
These are great questions. Recognizing, I think we have to be very humble about what we know and what we don't know ourselves. Collectively, but individually,
mm-hmm.
and recognizing that we can have certain thoughts or have certain questions that arise, but seeing that as part of an experience that's impermanent. In Eastern traditions, Buddhism, impermanence is one of the preeminent laws, right? If it's a good day today, it's going to rain tomorrow, and if it's raining today, the sun's going to come out again, and the weather is always shifting. So recognizing that the moment that we're in is not the all-defining moment, that things will change, and we might be experiencing some doubts. We might feel really distant from God in the moment, or some questions may have arisen that have particular meaning to us, or feel particularly relevant or frustrating or curious or whatever at this moment in time. All of that's going to change. And so we have to hold all of our experience with a real humility, that whatever we think we know in any given moment is just what we think we know in that moment, and that God is going to continue to reveal to us. And I think that things will clear over time. I don't know that I've ever had a faith crisis in the sense of like a testimony crisis, but I very much had an existential crisis where I just felt like God had completely abandoned me and nothing made sense. All the rules that I thought I was operating by just were shattered, and God wasn't operating according to any of the things that I thought were supposed to be happening. And it was a real crisis of, I didn't know how to make sense of the world anymore. And so, but when I look back at that time, and it felt so defining in that moment. When I look back, it feels like a blip, right? In the broader scheme of all of the things and the experiences that I've had, feeling close to God, feeling distant from God, feeling like I knew, and then feeling like I didn't know. I think God kind of emerges through the whole of it, and we just have to be very careful not to put too much weight in any given moment, and just kind of hold it all with an openness and a humility, maybe more so than we're typically prone to do.
Yeah. The knowing is very interesting to me. Jeremiah talks about, with the new covenant, that they will know me, being God, and I will know them.
Yeah.
Which is a very, what does that really mean? What is he saying? But I think it's along the lines of what you guys talk about in this book. One of the chapters you have also has to do with knowing, which is being together, seeing as we are seen, and knowing as we are known. Right. So going back to the knowing again, what are you getting at with this? Right. What do you mean being seen as, or seeing as we are seen?
So this is one of those things that's like, I think about all the time. And the idea and the way that I conceptualize the gospel, and I think that one of the things that is so unique about Latter-day Saint theology is that it's rooted in relationship. And that phrase comes from D&C 76, where Joseph and Sydney have this vision of the celestial world. And this is before any theology of marriage is revealed, right? This is about the sociality of heaven, the church of the firstborn, that it's a quality of relationship where we see as we are seen and know as we are known infinitely. And if we were to kind of bring in ideas from John, that if God is love and we are becoming beings of love, then there's a quality of loving and being loved that is more profound than anything we will ever experience in this earth, in any relationship that we're in, and it's collective. It's not just about marriage. And so being with each other and sitting with each other and knowing each other fully and loving each other fully and seeing and being seen and being known and being loved, this intimacy, this is what I mean when I say role-oriented versus intimacy-oriented. The Latin root of intimacy is intimus, and that's to let you into my innermost parts, right? And when you let me into your innermost parts, then we have a relationship of intimacy, of seeing and being seen, knowing and being known. And this is something that I think is hard for us to do. Jacob, again, his mother passed away from cancer. And one of the things that she said before she passed away was that, very often people would come to kind of comfort her, but they were, it was kind of awkward. They didn't know what to say, so they didn't want to say the wrong thing, so they wouldn't say anything. And, they didn't know how to just be with her. And she said, I found myself needing, kind of comforting the people that were there to comfort me. And it was just exhausting. Like I didn't have it in me. And I think this idea of seeing and being seen, there's a Catholic writer that captures this a bit as well. I want to see if I can find this really quickly, because I think he captures where we kind of, I think we ultimately want to go with, or what this means for all of us. And it's kind of in the spirit of learning how to be compassionate. And he said it this way. He said, let us not underestimate how hard it is to be compassionate. Compassion is hard because it requires the inner disposition to go with others where they are weak, vulnerable, lonely, and broken. But this is not our spontaneous response to suffering. What we desire most is to do away with suffering by fleeing from it or finding a quick cure for it. As busy, active, relevant ministers, we want to earn our bread by making a real contribution. This means, first and foremost, doing something that shows that our presence makes a difference. And so we ignore our greatest gift, which is our ability to enter into solidarity with those who suffer. Those who can sit in silence with their fellow men, not knowing what to say, but knowing that they should be there, can bring new life to a dying heart. And this is, coming back to this early comment about that's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to not know what to say, or to not have the answer, or to have something that can't just be fixed when we want to fix it. To be with challenges, to be with suffering, it's hard. It's vulnerable. And so we'd rather just, go make a casserole than something that we feel like we can do and that we have control over, rather than just be with somebody in a very vulnerable place, And so, and I think this quality of eternal relationship is something that God is inviting us to practice in all of our relationships, learning how to experience deeper intimacy with each other all the time. Obviously something that we, in marriage, that's something we kind of think of as marriage. And when we use the word intimacy as a euphemism for sex, it's like, well, sex and intimacy become kind of one and the same. And I think we do a huge disservice to ourselves and to the idea of intimacy when we equate it with sex, right? And certainly in marriages, it's one context in which we practice intimacy with other humans. But I think to really learn how to be with each other without having to do anything is something that it's a spiritual practice on its own.
How different are we compared to what we think we are? In other words, you're talking about seeing as we are seen. So is that being seen by God, or is that being seen by those around us?
Both.
And how different is our idea of self compared to the persona or what other people think about us? Is that something you work with in your practice?
All the time. I mean, because a lot of our thoughts, when I work with people who have, we're working with core beliefs, as people have, as they struggle with depression, one of the kind of the key models of therapy that helps people work through depression is what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. But it's getting in and understanding our thoughts and where our thoughts are distorted. And very often, as you get in and you ask people to kind of talk about what their core beliefs are, right, that have shaped their world, they're really rough. And they're shaped by experiences, so they're understandable in the context of the experiences that they've had. But very often, the conception that people have of themselves is so different than how other people see them or how I see them in that moment. And when it's a really negative, kind of a shame-based, and it's really painful. It's hard to see people live in a world that is so where their sense of self is so deficient, right? And very often I've had the thought, and sometimes I've even said it, where I'm like, I look forward to the day when you can see yourself the way other people see you, right? And really believe that they're lovable, right? And that they're or likable, or just, that they are capable or strong, or those kinds of things, when their inner world and the narratives in which they live are so deficient.
So it seems like awareness, then, mindfulness, is necessary to understand what others might think about you. right? And how they know you. And if you're able to know them the way they know you, that seems to me to be that seems to me just to be based on truth, right? There's a truth in the middle there somewhere that you're probably afraid of moving toward.
Yeah. Getting outside of our own experience. And
Yeah.
especially there's a kind of safety and familiarity. And very often we'll opt for the familiar. This is true. I've done some work with where there's been intimate partner violence. And sometimes it's hard to get a woman out of an abusive relationship because it's familiar. And it might be painful, but it's a pain that they know. And they feel like it's familiar, they can deal with it, where to leave that relationship is very vulnerable. It's the unknown. And the unknown is scary.
Yeah.
And so we'll stick with what's familiar very often before we will risk kind of stepping into the unknown.
So to finalize here, what would you recommend to people to try and grow in mindfulness and awareness? What does somebody need to start with in order to become more aware and to slow down, to enjoy some stillness and, look toward the truth a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. So the thing with mindfulness, and the thing that really differentiates it from other forms of meditation, and the word meditation is really, kind of, to use as an analogy, right? Meditation is like athletics, right? It's a genre. And there are lots of different sports and different kinds of sports that might, utilize different skill sets and build different skill sets. And mindfulness is one form of meditation. And it's a form of meditation. And one of the reasons that I think it's made such inroads in the West is that it is very accessible. You're not just kind of sitting on a mountaintop humming mantras or the lotus position, right? You can eat mindfully. You can be with a person mindfully, like right as we're having this conversation, right? Am I fully with you, or am I thinking about what all the other things that I need to be doing tonight, right? Or you can be parenting mindfully, where you're just being fully present with your kids. One of the things that often people will talk about when they're talking about kind of pain points in their family of origin, very often I'll hear people say something like, I never really felt seen as a child. I just kind of felt like I was being managed all the time. And very often that's what parents are doing. And again, as a parent, I get, right? Kids, there's so much going on, and it's just, you're managing things all the time. And very often in all of the managing that we're doing, we're not really seeing our kids, and we're not really communicating to them or seeing them in a way that they're at least feeling seen and feeling understood. And often we're kind of dismissive of their feelings, right? They're sad, and it's like, they'll be fine, right? And so practicing mindfulness with our children is being fully present with them when they're feeling sad, really getting down with them and being with them in their sadness and talking with them, and tell me what that's like for you, or whatever that is. Or being with our spouse in a mindful way, just very often couples, when they're on their, they have they're committed to their date night, but they spend a lot of their date night on their cell phones, and so they might be physically with each other, but they're not present with each other when they're kind of sitting on their phones. And so that's the kind of thing. You can just mindfulness to be, going on your date night mindfully is, when you're with each other, put down your phones and really just look at each other and be with each other and be open and curious, right, about the other, and where you can be, taking the sacrament mindfully, being fully present with the words of the sacrament prayers. And so anything that you do,
which, by the way, they both of those prayers ask us to remember, right? They're both calling for an awareness in those prayers.
Yeah. And John Kabat-Zinn, in his first book, and this was the first book I ever read, it was called Full Catastrophe Living. He has this kind of section on when he talks about the word remember, right? And we think of remembering as a cognitive exercise, typically, right? I recall something. But he said the word, to be a member of something is to be a part of something, to be connected to it, to be in it. And to remember is to reconnect, to become a part of again when we've disconnected. So to remember Christ is to remember myself to Christ, not just to recall him in my mind, right? to remember myself to the feeling of the Spirit, right? To the feeling, or to remember myself to God by being with God. So I think this whole idea of remembering, if we unpack that, there's so many different ways in which the gospel is calling us to reconnect ourselves to spiritual things,
Sure.
in every moment.
The book then is The Power of Stillness, Mindful Living for Latter-day Saints. It is written by Jacob Hess, Carrie Scarda, correct?
Yep. Uh-huh.
Kyle Anderson, and our guest here, Ty Mansfield. So I would advise the audience to go out and take a look at that and incorporate some of this. It's a very interesting book, and I think it's very applicable for a modern Western member of the church. So Ty, thank you so much for taking the time and being mindful of us and aware of what you do and how it might apply to ourselves.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.